Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to your viewers. I agree 100%. We, at least on the face of it, seem to have a situation where somebody was really undertrained and ill-equipped for the work that he was mandated to do. And in this case, it's enforcing city bylaws and ended up in a confrontation that quickly escalated and turned violent and fatal.
What kind of training should someone who's given this kind of power actually have? I mean, a gun is one thing, a uniform is one thing, but together they are very, very powerful.
I agree at 100%. At the very least, you would see that there has to be firearm training in terms of storage and handling a firearm correctly. But then what goes along with that, particularly in terms of community policing, has to be response and escalation and de-escalation, most importantly, strategies. So you shouldn't have a situation where a police officer or a law enforcement officer, in this case, is involved in a confrontation with a member of the public, whether they're suspected of committing a crime or, in this case, the bylaw violation, and then have a situation that ends in the fatal shooting of someone. This really should have been, the law enforcement officer having enough training to de-escalate the situation, to, fine the individual as necessary, and then to be able to walk away from the situation.
I mean, there's so many levels of training you would need here. You'd need firearms training, which we've mentioned, but also, as you're pointing to, the kind of training that a community police officer, I mean, you can police in different ways. You can do law and order, and you can do safety and security. Those are very different things, even though they can sound quite similar. You want someone who can actually help police a community.
Precisely. And I think that it's really important to give context as to how much, for example, SAPS officers or how much training they have to go through. They initially start with basic police development learning program or training, and then only after that do they graduate into several different aspects of training, including at an academy level and then at a police station. And that can take up to 24 months. According to media reports, these LEAP officers have as little as 6 weeks of training. That's not nearly enough to be able to interact with the public, particularly when they've been given firearms as well.
There's also a whole kind of interplay system now, an interplay of different forces, because you have a city police force, and then you have the South African Police Service. How are they supposed to sort of work together here? I presume the SAPS has a legal supremacy of some kind.
You are 100% correct. In any work undertaken by municipal police services, and in this case, the Cape Metro Police Service, as well as these LEAP officers, has to fall under sort of city bylaw enforcement, and they can, at the very least, sort of help with patrolling or basic sort of safety and enforcement activities. But, for example, they can't, sort of enter situations and investigate crimes actively themselves. They're only there for bylaw enforcement. And that means that if dangerous work is undertaken, they're meant to be working in connection with or in sort of operation with the SAPS. You really don't want to see a situation where you have city police officers, city law enforcement officers going into dangerous situations and discharging their firearms.
It's quite strange in another way, because you have the Metro Police. I mean, many people around the country, Durban has a Metro Police, Joburg has one, Tshwane has one, Ekurhuleni has one, Cape Town, as I understand it, has one. But this is a law enforcement advancement plan. I'm not even sure I know what that is.
The way that I understand it, I think the structure has been very opaque from the very beginning, with the first deployment of these officers in February 2020. But the way that I understand it is that these officers are meant to be particularly assigned and deployed to crime hotspots to sort of do the work of visible policing, quote unquote. There's nothing wrong with the city or the province wanting to do that and wanting to be a force multiplier to the SAPS. But again, they can't be active in their sort of work in terms of investigating or intelligence gathering, because that's very specifically the type of work that SAPS must do and must be involved in. And so I think what we're seeing is that you sort of have this force or law enforcement group that's meant to do basic city-level sort of work and bylaw enforcement that has, at the very least, seems to starting to be doing scope creep and into the work of the SAPS, and that's a very worrying development.
Is there another element to this? And Ziyanda, I mean, this is policing. There are so many different things that we can talk about. We can go on forever, and maybe in a way we should. But the Western Cape Provincial Government, which of course is the DA, has said for many years, and I think with some justification, that they have not had the same number of South African police service officers as the rest of the country. And I know they're sort of hard numbers to suggest that the policing ratio in the Western Cape, in other words, the ratio of police officers to population, is not the same as in other places, despite the fact that in certain places like Khayelitsha, there are very high levels of crime. The response then from a provincial government which is elected in a democracy would be to train their own officers. I mean, there's a whole complex context that's playing out here in terms of the relationship between the Western Cape, the city of Cape Town, and then national government and the South African Police Service.
Precisely, and I think that the sort of political layers to this, you're 100% correct in identifying that it sort of gives rise to this fierce competition, really, between all of these law enforcement groups, instead of there being collaboration and sort of co-working. I think that we really need to get to a point where we de-incentivize or disincentivize the various sort of layers of government from trying to claw at each other and sort of either point to each other failures in policing and rising crime levels, and rather get to a point where particularly a program such as LEAP still ensures that all of the officers who are involved, and particularly who are out in the streets and interacting with the public, have the highest level of training possible. If that's not the case, then I'm very afraid that we'll see more incidents such as these, given the goal of the sort of LEAP program is to deploy 1,000 additional officers onto the streets.
There's another much bigger dynamic here. You have a person who does not have a home. He's trying to cook a meal. He's doing it outside. Okay, that may or may not be illegal. It's a whole different question around that. But in our society, it's actually quite a difficult society to police because of the social problems that we have, and there are very many reasons as to why we have these problems. But if you look at what's happening, particularly in the Western Cape, you have more and more people coming into the cities, desperately looking for a job and a place to live. And what I'm talking about is the amount of stress in our society has increased over the last 2 years, and the years before that, is likely to continue increasing, and the police are the people who are caught in the middle.
Precisely, and I would even go so far as to say that the police, are now in very many ways the sort of frontline service of a lot of government services, or at least in terms of interactions, with the public. When you have failing service delivery, when you have failing infrastructure, and in many communities, particularly low-income communities around Cape Town, that is very much the case. So you have police officers being, deployed to quell sort of protests, or to then interact with people who are experiencing homelessness, and either to fine them or to detain them. And that puts a lot more police officers and law enforcement officers, in interaction and in the public, as opposed to the social services that are necessary, really, to prevent homelessness, to prevent, a lot of the social problems that also drive people out onto the streets, and that can include mental illness as well as drug addiction. So all of these compounding social problems, are leading to far more incidents of interactions between the public and the police, whether at a city or a national level. And this is why we, again, desperately need incredibly high levels of training to prevent situations where people die when they're interacting with the police.
Do we need to look at our training system completely differently? I mean, the police officers that we have themselves been, in a way, brutalized by the job. They're dealing with very high levels of stress. Many of them will have, been in very dangerous situations over many years. Do we need to sort of re-look at what kind of police officer we actually need?
I would agree with that sentiment highly. I write in my book, and I speak about this idea that is constantly sort of sold to us by politicians, that we need more police, more resources, more boots on the ground. And that isn't necessarily true in every single circumstance. As we were talking about with the rollout of social services, that typically lowers, the need for police intervention, or even sort of rising crime levels. And I would even say that with as I mentioned, 24 months of training for new police officers, a lot of that is actually undone at the station level. When police officers arrive at a station or a precinct, and have a station commander who has little respect for the law, or who themselves, doesn't believe in the training that's provided to police recruits. That's how you also end up in a situation where police officers who are trained and who should know better don't do better. So there really is a lot that we need to tackle when it comes to security and policing, and training is but one aspect.
I mean, I suppose in a perfect world, there's so many other ways that this incident could have ended. In a perfect world, we're very far from a perfect society, you could have had a police officer who would have left their gun in the car or wherever, gone up to this homeless person and said, why are you doing this? Can we find a safer way to do whatever it is that you want to do? Let's try and help you in some way. I realize that that's difficult, and it's difficult in any city in the world, but there's so many other ways this one incident could have ended.
I again agree with that, and I think it's also really important to note that I understand that doing the work of law enforcement is dangerous, and not every single situation will have a law enforcement officer dealing with somebody who is calm or unarmed or rational, but there are many other tools that are non-lethal that could be used by a police officer if they feel that their safety is threatened. There are batons and tasers and pepper spray, and again, sort of other tools, particularly centered around training, around de-escalation of conflict situations. And we would love to live in a perfect world, of course, but I think that there is definitely multiple universes, between what happened yesterday and a situation where this confrontation didn't even need to take place.
Ziyanda Stuurman, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. Independent security analyst, author of the book, Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa.